Hello, my name is Dr. Carla Muñoz Esquivel. This session is about data protection and GDPR. So the rationale. Who is not citizen of the digital world today? Technology is evolving so fast and therefore law must evolve so consumer trust can follow. The Data Protection Bill, which includes the General Data Protection Regulation, is a response to this technology revolution. GDPR was created to protect the people, and it brings more privacy considerations for organizations that they have to meet according to public policy. Since changes in data regulation law are converging globally, in addition, identifying individual profiles in big data in order to protect their privacy is becoming increasingly complex, while big data also increases new tools are necessary to solve this problem. Data protection and GDPR. So the General Data Protection Legislation is an European legislation and aims to protect the processing of people's personal data and its free movement. It is updating measures to improve the pre-GDPR legal requirements that organizations were required to accept for processing personal data. It was not a revolution because the real revolution was in the 1970s when all computers started to be in our homes and it was the internet. And then when the beginning of data protection law started to be in our lives, that is Directive 95/46 EC. The letter was a data protection law abolished by GDPR and the basis for the UK's Data Protection Act 1998. Examples are the obligation to ensure that only a minimum quantity of data are used for any particular purpose, that is data minimization, the obligation to process only such information on people as it's relevant to the purposes of the processing, so purpose limitation, obligation to supply a copy of their personal data making a request, that is data subject access, and obligation to apply appropriate security provisions to personal data processing. An obligation to destroy or delete data held after they become obsolete. We have that the GDPR new obligations. GDPR reproduces much of the previous applicable data protection law. However, it includes several new obligations, representing a challenge that involves for organizations in order to comply with significant time and money. So examples of these obligations are the obligation to conduct data protection impact assessments, obligation of creating products and services with personal data protections in mind from the beginning of the creation process, that is process by design, and requirements to publish certain documentation to appoint a data protection officer, that is a DPO, and notify breaches to both national regulators and potentially affected individuals. The current excessive interest and awareness in GDPR and data protection legal requirements is owed to three reasons in specific. The first one is the significant increase in levels of penalties and fines that can be imposed, that is the amount of money that companies now have to pay if there is a breach of data, which are up to 20 million euros or 4% of global annual turnover. The second is the apparent extraterritorial applicability of GDPR, since the law attempts to regulate organizations based outside EU, which supply products or services to EU citizens, even when such organizations don't have an EU presence or establishment. This is a regulation. As a result, it has immediate binding effect in all EU member states without any further action from them. Although the GDPR regulation, as other regulations, include provisions that allow all member states to create additional rules, such as exceptions, and the main body of the provisions is identical across EU. Also in this way, the Parliament of the member states don't have the opportunity to water down the law requirements. What is the UK situation now that UK leaves the EU? Well, several member states have introduced national legislations to clarify GDPR applicability, including defining the scope of exceptions of some rules when possible. The Data Protection Bill 2017, the UK's own draft legislation, is unusual in this regard, since it tries to deal with the UK position regarding data protection after Brexit. The bill acknowledges that the most personal data processing operations in the UK are subject to the GDPR and is to apply the same rules contained in the GDPR to areas of UK activity that wouldn't be otherwise covered by the regulation because they fall outside of EU competence, with the exception of law enforcement and processing by intelligence services. The bill also deals with the powers of the Information Commissioner and enforcement. It appears that further UK measure is intended to unify the regimes in the GDPR and the Data Protection Bill, so it might be replaced by a single provision as the UK replacement. GDPR versus the bill. GDPR seeks wider applicability. The law applies to any activity that has data protection consequences for individuals in the European Union, including in this context the countries of the European Economic Area or EEA. It does this by applying to the processing of personal data by a controller or processor which has an establishment in the EU where the processing is in the context of the activities of the organization, regardless the processing takes place in the EU or not. The processing of the data of data subjects who are in the EU by a controller or processor, which is not established yet in the EU, where the processing of activities are related to the offering of goods or services to data subjects in the EU, irrespective of whether a payment by the data subject is required or the monitoring of their behavior so far the behavior takes place within the EU. The bill modifies this in respect of processing data that was outside the scope of EU law before the Brexit by complex provision in Clause 186, substituting Article 3 of GDPR with a modifier version of Clause 186. Controllers established outside the UK and offering services to individuals in the UK or monitoring their behavior or processor working for controllers established outside the UK who are undertaking such processing are excluded from these rules. So monitoring the behavior in Recital 24 of GDPR says it occurs when individuals are tracked on the internet with data processing techniques that consist on applying a profile to an individual in order to make decisions concerning the individual or analyzing and predicting an individual's personal preferences, behaviors, and attitudes. For example, behavioral advertising. Non-EU organizations, particularly those which sell into several EU states, may be subject to the law of every member state in which they operate. GDPR and its UK replacement also applies to processing which is not established in the EU or the UK, but in a place where the law of the member states applies by virtue of public international law. So, for example, an EU member state's embassy in Far Eastern country, the data protection laws applying to the embassy activities are those of the member state by virtue of treaties applying to embassies, rather than the local law of the state in which the embassy is seated. In general terms, the data protection law of the GDPR applies within the UK and the member states of the European Union, plus Norway, Liechtenstein, and Iceland, the latter being the remaining European Free Trade Area members, which are also members of the EEA, plus any other country outside of EU offering goods or services to EU people. In terms of the UK data protection law after Brexit will apply to all organizations in the UK established in the UK, but not to non-UK organizations that offer goods or services to data subjects in the UK, or which monitor the behavior of persons in the UK. So GDPR key definitions. The first is that GDPR only applies to processing of personal data. But what is personal data? Well, in Article 4 of GDPR says that personal data means any information related to an identified or identifiable natural person. An identifiable natural person is one who can be identified, directly or indirectly, in particular by reference to an identifier such as a name, an identification number, location data, an online identifier, or to one or more factors specific to the physical, physiological, genetic, mental, economic, cultural, or social identity of that natural person. You as an organization should know if you are processing personal data. If you are doing it, you should know what amount of personal data are you processing and what type of data. Processing is any operation or set of operations which is performed on personal data or on sets of personal data, whether or not by automated means such as collection, recording, organization, structuring, storage, adaptation or alteration, retrieval, consultation, use, disclosure by transmission, dissemination or otherwise making available, alignment or combination, restriction, erasure or destruction. And the bill applies a similar definition. By comparison, the term structuring is added and restriction is substituted for blocking. What is a filing system? Well, in Article 2 of the GDPR, it was not in the formal DPA agreement as relevant filing system. It is an structured set of personal data which are accessible according to specific criteria, whether decentralized, centralized, or dispersed on a functional or geographical basis by category within it. Particularly, if there was a substantial quantity of it. Its characteristics are the structuring by reference to individuals and or the ready accessibility of specific information. This is because GDPR is applicable to electronically processed personal data, but also to an information contained in paper-based, certain manual records, which are part of the filing system, for example, chronological ordered sets of records including personal data. Other two definitions that are very important is controller is the entity that is responsible for complying with data protection law. Defines a controller as a natural or legal person, public authority, agency, or other body which alone or jointly with others determines the purpose of means or processing of personal data. A data protection officer is an individual person formally appointed with statutory functions within an organization who has responsibility for data protection compliance within the organization who has responsibility for data protection compliance within the organization. Under GDPR, it's compulsory for many organizations to appoint a DPO. However, when not required to do so, many medium-sized and large data controllers will choose to appoint one or more DPOs, informally to carry out data protection functions and to ensure the compliance of the organization within data protection legal requirements. It's important to know that DPO is not liable for the data protection breaches of the controller. Well, a processor is a natural or legal person, public authority, agency, or any body which processes personal data out of the controller. The GDPR regulation imposes formal responsibilities on the processors for first time, but controllers remain legally responsible for some of the processing operations carried out by the processor. As well as holding statutory responsibilities under the regulation, processors should be required by their controllers to enter into a written contract or agreement which obliges them to give guarantees as to data protection compliance, including security provisions, and to process personal data only on the instruction of the relevant controller. The Data Protection Directive created this sensitive personal data category. This is called special categories or personal data. A controller is not allowed to process the special categories of personal data under GDPR. This is the racial or the ethnic origin of the data subject, his/her political opinions, his/her religious or philosophical beliefs, whether the person is a member of the trade union, genetic data for the purpose of identifying a unique person, biometric data concerning her health, or data concerning a natural person's sex life or sexual orientation. Information about the commission or alleged commission of an offense, or any proceeding concerning offenses or alleged offenses, their disposal legally or any sentence in relation to them has been removed from the definition of special categories of data, and they are dealt in a separate article of GDPR, that is Article 10. The definition of main establishment. This is defined by GDPR in Article 4, and this was especially defined by organizations with more than one establishment in the EU. The location of the main establishment determines which national data protection regulator, supervisory authority, will deal with the organizations. The main establishment of the controller in EU is administrative center, unless its decisions on the purposes and the means of the processing are taken in another establishment within the EU, which have the power to have its decisions implemented, in which case establishment will be the main one. The main establishment of a processor in the EU is its administrative center, or it has none within the EU, the place within the EU where the main processing activities in the context of the activities of the establishment take place. If a controller or a processor is based outside the EU, it will have to appoint a representative subject to certain exceptions in one of the EU member states where the data subjects to whom goods or services are offered or whose behavior is monitored are located to act on behalf of the controller or processor and to deal with the supervisory authorities and with those data subjects. This will apply to many UK companies after Brexit. A representative is defined as a natural or legal person established in EU who is designated by a controller or a processor in writing and who represents a controller or processor with regard to their respective obligations under the GDPR. The exceptions are where the processing is only occasional, doesn't include the processing of special categories of data in large scale, and it's unlikely to result in a risk to the rights and freedoms, the privacy of individuals. A public authority or body is also exempt from the requirements. And after Brexit, where a controller or a processor is based outside the UK but offers goods or services of data to subjects in the UK or monitors their behavior, the controller or processor is likely to appoint a representative in the UK. Data subject, defined in the GDPR Article 4, forms part of the definition of personal data and refers to a person who is either identified or identifiable. And the concept of identifiability runs to the previous definition of data subject to include individuals whose identity is not known at the time the data are collected, but who may be identified in the future. For example, when a controller undertakes additional research investigation or adds additional data. pseudonymization, and means the processing of personal data, so the data can no longer be attributed to a specific data subject without the use of additional information, provided such additional information is kept separately and is subject to technical and organizational measures to ensure that the person is not identifiable. The data subject is given a different identity for the purposes of processing, and the controller or processor have a different key to unlock the identity, which it keeps secure. Unlike anonymized data, personal data which has been pseudonymized remains personal data. Profiling means any form of automated processing of personal data, consistent of the use of personal data to evaluate certain personal aspects relating to a natural person, in particular to analyze or predict aspects concerning that natural person's performance at work, economic situation, health, personal preferences, interests, reliability, behavior, location, or movements. This definition is linked to the right to object to profiling in certain circumstances, to be informed about the existence of profiling and of measures based on profiling, and to be provided with meaningful information about the logic involved, as well as the significance and the envisaged consequences of profiling for the data subject. The main instances of the use of profiling are likely to arise from the use of cookies on a website to analyze personal preferences in the browsing carried out by an individual. Personal data breach. This is related to a breach of a security leading to the accidental or unlawful destruction, loss, alteration, unauthorized disclosure of access to personal data transmitted, stored, or otherwise processed. In Article 23 of the GDPR, it is stated that a controller is obligated to report personal data breaches to the supervisory authority unless it is unlikely to result in a risk to the rights and freedom of natural persons. A very hard threshold before there is no duty to report. In Article 34, it is stated that personal data breaches must be reported to data subjects, where the breach is likely to result in a high risk to the rights and freedom of natural persons. Data subject consent is very important because any freely given, specific, informed, and unambiguous indication of his/her wishes by which the data subject, either by statement or by clear affirmative action, signifies agreement to personal data related to them to be processed. Consent remains a legal basis for processing of personal data. In relation to explicit consent, but the circumstances in which consent will be valid have been narrowed. When controller is relying on consent to justify processing, GDPR Article 7 requires the controller to be able to demonstrate the consent, where it is given the form of a written declaration, which also concerns other matters. The request for consent must be presented in a manner clearly distinguishable from other matters, in an intelligibly and easily accessible form, using clear and plain language, and the data subject must have the right to withdraw his/her consent at any time, and it must be as easy to withdraw consent as to give it. One definition that is also very important is the definition of a child, and we know that it's a person below of the age of 16, and processing the data of a child is lawfully only when with the consent of the parent or custodian. This restriction applies only where those services are provided on the basis of an individual's consent. It's important that the law of member states, for example, the UK law after Brexit in the bill, may provide for a lower age, for example, down to 13. We have genetic data is related to any data associated with inherited or acquired genetic characteristics of a natural person, which give unique information about the physiology or the health of that person, and which are sold from an example of a biological sample from that natural person, for example, DNA or RNA analysis, or the analysis of another element enabling equivalent information to be obtained. Under Article 9, GDPR genetic data are included as a special category of personal data and requires additional protection. If a controller wishing to process genetic data or any other special category must meet requirements of condition to process that are in Article 9. Biometric data is similar to genetic data because it's resulting from technical processing related to the physical, physiological, or behavioral characteristics of a natural person, which allowed or confirm a unique identification of that person. So facial images, dactyloscopic data, that is fingerprints, and etc. So recipient is a natural or legal person, public authority, agency, or other body to which personal data are disclosed, whether or not by a third party, public authorities that receive personal data as part of an inquiry conducted under EU or UK law are not regarded as recipients of that data. However, they process this data must be in compliance with the data protection rules. Data protection by design requires that the controller, both when determining the means of processing and at the time of processing itself, to implement in an effective manner appropriate technical and organizational measures such as pseudonymization, which are designed to ensure compliance with data protection principles, such as data minimization. Some principles that should be built in the design of processing operations are processing the least quantity of personal data, use secure identities, pseudonymization, data compliance should be built from the offset, and safeguards to protect privacy and rights of data subjects. Protection by default, which means the controller is required to implement appropriate technical and organizational measures to ensure that, by default, only personal data which are necessary for each specific purpose of the processing are processed. This takes the design purpose at the stage further. It's necessary to ensure by default that personal data are not made accessible to an identifiable number of natural persons without the intervention of the individual. Some action demonstrating his/her consent, so it should always have the consent of the people to process the data. And the obligation applies to the amount of personal data collected, the extent of processing, and the period of storage and accessibility of the data. GDPR makes provision for member states, supervisory authorities, and the European Data Protection Board and the European Commission to encourage the drawing up of codes of conduct intended to assist in applying the GDPR regulation. Bodies representative of categories of controllers and processors may prepare codes to apply the legislation, especially, for example, in areas like fair and transparent processing. The legitimate interest of controllers, information provided to children and their protection, data protection by design and default, security and notification of breaches, and the resolution of disputes. Codes or an amendments of revision of them are subject to the approval of supervisory authorities. So codes covering processing in several member states are to be submitted by the supervisory authority. Then the local supervisory authority gives approval to the European Data Protection Board for an opinion as to whether the proposed safeguards are adequate. These are approved by the EU Commission, may do an implementing act that decide that the code will have general validity within the EU and make them publicly available. The definition of joint controller is there are two or more controllers who can determine the purposes and means of processing, so they must determine their respective responsibilities in a transparent manner, particularly regarding the exercises by individuals of their rights, and the controller's duties to provide information to individuals. This should be done by an arrangement between the controllers, including possibility, a single point of data subjects, unless EU or member states or UK law determines otherwise. The essence of these arrangements must be made available for data subjects, although it's unclear at what point. An individual may independently of such arrangements exercise his/her rights against each data controller. The European Data Protection Board. This is an EU body with legal responsibilities and is comprised of the head of the supervisory authority in each EU member state or their representative. The European Commission has a right to participate but doesn't have a vote, and its functions include resolving disagreements between supervisory authorities, ensuring a consistent application of GDPR, giving advice or guidance, approving EU guide codes and certifications, and producing an annual report on data protection in EU. Delegated acts. These are acts that can be adopted by the European Union in relation to different types of information, subject to conditions. These relate either to standardized icons that may be used in data processing, notices, or mechanisms for certification under Article 43. The acts are subject to revocation by the European Parliament and the Council of Ministers, but otherwise come into force within 3 months if there is no objection by either body, or sooner if they give notice of no objection within that time. The time scale may be extended to 6 months if either body gives notice that a further 3 months is required. The data protection certification. So these are mechanisms, seals, and marks to demonstrate compliance by controllers and processors. And this must be encouraged by the member state supervisory authorities, the EDPB, and the European Commission. Certification is voluntary, is required to be transparent, and are issued by certification bodies or by the supervisory authority or the European Data Protection Board. It doesn't reduce the level of compliance nor replace the need for it, and they can also be gained by controllers outside their territorial scope in relation to data transfers and to third country certifications that can last a maximum of 3 years and is renewable if conditions continue to be met. The one-stop shop. These organizations can work across multiple member states, so it's subject to oversight of more than one national data protection regulator. The GDPR resolves this by designating a lead authority as a relevant regulator for any particular controller or processor, and the lead authority is the one for the country in which the organization's main establishment is located. the Directive on Security of Network and Information Systems. This one came into force in August of 2016 and represents the first EU-wide rules on cybersecurity. And the objective is to achieve a high common level of security within the EU by three means. One is improving capabilities in relation to cybersecurity at national level, and this is important because each member state is required to adopt a national strategy on security, defining strategic objectives and appropriate measures of policy and regulation, and it is required to designate a national level authority to monitor the application of the strategy and to designate a computer security incident response team. 2. Monitor incidents at national level, provide early warning, respond to incidents, and participate in wider networks. Increase cooperation at EU level. This means a cooperation group of member states is to facilitate strategic cooperation and exchange of information and provide a network of national computer security incident response teams. Then placing obligation concerning the management of risk and reporting of incidents onto operators of essential services and digital service providers. This means operators of essential services are private businesses or public entities with an important role for society or the economy. Identifying operators will have to take appropriate security measures, including preventing risks, ensuring the security of their systems, and handling incidents to minimize their impact. Serious incidents should be notified to the national authority. The operators concerned are to be identified by the member states on the basis of criteria such as their importance to critical societal or economical activities or the effects of a security incident on that service, such as in the case of the energy, transport, banking, financial, health, water, and digital information sectors. Digital service providers, those providing, for example, online marketplaces, cloud computing services, or search engines, are also covered unless they are small enterprises. The Directive on Personal Data Processes for Criminal Law Enforcement. This one came into force in May of 2016 and applies to processing for policing and judicial activities concerning criminal matters, both national and across borders. It includes processing by law enforcement agencies for prevention, investigation, detection, or prosecution of criminal offenses, or the execution of criminal penalties, or for public security. It doesn't apply to processing by EU institutional bodies or to activities outside the scope of the EU law. The directive covers a number of areas of similar ground to the GDPR in relation to lawful principles of processing, collection for specific and non-excessive purposes, and access and other rights for individuals. Controllers have similar obligations in relation to the designation of a DPO and assessing the potential impact of processing likely to result in high risk. The supervisory authorities can be the same, and there are rules on mandatory mutual assistance. The activities of the EDPB include this directive. Data subjects are entitled to compensation for processing contrary to the rules. Transfers to third country of personal data covered by the directive may only occur if they are required for law enforcement processes, and if the European Commission has adopted an adequacy decision in respect of that country, or as under the GDPR under appropriate safeguards or in specific circumstances. Under Article 6 of the directive, controllers are required to distinguish the personal data of different categories of data subjects. For example, those with regard to whom there are serious grounds to suspect that they have committed or are about to commit a criminal offense. Persons convicted of a criminal offense, victims of crime, or other parties to a criminal offense such as witnesses. And in Article 7, introduces a distinction to be made so far as possible between personal data based on facts and personal data on personal assessments. Overall, the directive appears to give greater control than under GDPR to member states. Data protection law requires compliance with a number of rules, principles, and in GDPR these are in Article 5. Unless a relevant exemption applies, all of the principles should be observed in relation to all aspects of personal data processing, so all of them have to be complied with to comply with GDPR. Personal data shall be processed lawfully, fairly, and in transparent manner in relation to the data subject. Personal data also should be collected only for specific, explicit, and legitimate purposes, and not further processed in a manner that is incompatible with those purposes. Personal data shall be adequate, relevant, and limited to what is necessary in relation to the purposes which they are processed. Then personal data processed shall be accurate and where necessary kept up to date accuracy. Personal data shall also be kept in a form which permits identification of data sockets for no longer than is necessary for the purposes for which the personal data are processed. Personal data shall be processed in a manner that ensures appropriate security of the personal data, including protection against unauthorized or unlawful processing and against accidental loss, destruction, or damage, using appropriate technical or organizational measures. How the data compliance is changing how companies work. Identify individual profiles in big data in order to protect people's privacy is becoming increasingly complex, while big data and noise also increase. New tools are necessary to solve this problem in order to comply with expanded regulations like GDPR and the risk of fines and losing the trust of people who makes business possible. Artificial intelligence is a solution to this problem of discovering the human data in order to protect and monitor it. And the first step to security is to identify what is sensitive personal information that you handle. How will you map it? In what form or shape do they occur? In a single word, in a sentence, in a paragraph, in an entire document, or if you are obtaining information through a form, in a website. So how you detect the occurrence of this information accurately and where it happens. We have different methods of detecting sensitive information. Manual labeling of relevant occurrences. Every file created will have to be passed through a domain expert, person able to detect if the document is sensitive with respect to domain, making relevant sentences, words, or sections. The problem is that this is unrealistic. It requires significant amount of time and attention to detail. Have familiarity with data protection regulations as well. So it's not only about having information of the domain, you also need information about the regulations of GDPR and confidentiality. Know about all received and generated documents have to be reviewed by the domain experts. This may be carried on by, for example, national security agencies, military units, and embassies. AI labeling involves the use of automatic methods to detect relevant information with a lesser amount of human involvement. Some methods are based on exact matches of terms or series of characters, rely on statistical methods based on occurrences and adjust frequencies within a document or paragraph. More advanced methods attempts to utilize the context of every word in a sentence, whether it is relevant or not, using deep learning or natural language processing. So there are different methods that can solve different tasks, and this can go from rule-based, statistical-based, and machine learning, context-aware, and deep learning methods. Rule-based methods, for example, for classification, text-sensitive data are use exact patterns of numbers, characters, or specific terms, also known as regular expressions. Once those definitions are in place, every piece of data containing such data can be detected directly. It's very frequently used when matching ID numbers, credit card numbers, and email addresses, but it's insufficient because you have to tailor all the rules and terms and requires lots of effort. There can be a high number of false positives as well, because not every string of 9 digits a security number, and a lack of context. The sentence or information around is ignored. Machine learning methods of classification, we have supervised learning to categorize sensitive data files according to the content. Supervised learning is a machine learning task of inferring a mapping between data inputs and outputs based on ground truth, samples of input-output pairs. This type of documents, NDAs, for example, non-disclosure agreements, and resumes. We use a natural language processing. You look at the frequency of the words. Word embedding. Words closer in the vector space are expected to have a similar meaning to enable the transformation of each arbitrary piece of text into a fixed sign of numerical vector representation. And then we use a machine and deep learning algorithms that are trained with the input of the labeled data samples and the documents and their corresponding labels, so those are corresponding categories. The algorithm will generalize the essence of the classification even to never seen examples or sets and attempt to classify them accurately. Using clustering can achieve a holistic meaning mapping of a vast number of instances, which is a form of unsupervised learning. So models are to learn references between data points and classify the raw data without guidance or ground truth provider. So for example, all documents in the organization were represented by data points in a vector space, so that similar documents are within close distance from one another. A set of statistical algorithms can be used to group together such similar documents. And then we have that machine learning offers methods that can greatly improve on rule-based methods to detect, map, and categorize sensitive documents on an organizational level. Entity names is done during parsing, persons, organizations, locations, and then index just the relevant entities with the documents referring to them. And this is where named entity recognition becomes useful. So what is named entity recognition? It's an AI method of extracting any specific mention of named entity with a set of unstructured text. The named entities are classified into categories according to the context in which they appear. Their method can be automated using deep learning models, which impressive precision and recall scores each sentence is converted into a sequence of vectors, which are then passed forward to current neural networks that were trained to locate and classify named entities using the entire sentence context. The ultimate goal is to detect, index, and query effortlessly the meaningful names to be detected. Well, contextual personal information detection is the context that tells the full story. So understanding context is also important when analyzing if a company maintains inferences considered personal information under privacy laws. The GDPR, as we saw earlier, specifies several categories of personal information for which processing is prohibited. This is sensitive information, therefore organizations that would like to comply with GDPR must find and treat accordingly the occurrences of such personal information residing in its data. Such pieces of information don't fit neatly in structured tables, but surface in unstructured text in free form, which mechanisms can be used to find descriptions of a person's ethnicity or religious views. For example, John has Indian origins versus John has Indian food. So training machines to differentiate between contextual information of sentences requires linguistic understanding, ability to parse sentences, and some utilization of context. There is a new research in natural language processing that calls word2vec, which can be a solution. It uses a fixed meaningful vector representation for each word in a text. With this technology, every sentence can then be represented as a sequence of vectors. If deep learning methods based on neural networks are applied on those vectors, can be attained contextual representations of text, a summarized encoding for every input text based on a sequence of word vectors. We look at data protection and GDPR in the light of the UK situation. We also reviewed a few key definitions, and if further needed, where more information about them can be reviewed. Also, we reviewed 2 directives created just before GDPR and that support it. And in addition, a brief summary of the GDPR principles was given. And we also reviewed different methods that can be used by organizations to identify sensitive personal data. AI methods are superior than rule-based methods. In addition, AI methods that use the context to reason about meaningful words seem the way forward to protect people's privacy and comply with data protection regulations.